Hard Reuben. Oh my God.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of Hard Reuben's Force-Fed Cafe. Today, my guest is producer, artist, musician, and guitar monster Michael Sanders. Having this conversation was a real treat for me. If you've listened to this podcast before, you will have heard me reference life as a teenager in London, Ontario in the 80s. And while I am loath to turn this podcast into a total rehash of my teenage years, I do try to make it a blend of the new and the old school. Now, don't be alarmed if you hear me calling London a bleak town. It was. And this bleakness, in my view, fostered one of the most vibrant underground communities I have ever heard of or been a part of. I consider myself privileged to have grown up in that scene, which spanned from punk to metal with lots in between. And much of the music of that era still sparks my inner fire. All bands you should try to find and check out. Napalm Babies, 63 Monroe, The Mad, October Crisis, Condo Christ, The Legend Killers, Suffer Machine, 98DA, SFH, The Black Donnellys, The Generics, and Dyoxen. There are many, many more, but these were a few of the bands that blew my mind. Today's guest was a huge part of that scene and my musical journey back in those years, with his thrash metal band, Dyoxen. A local London band that produced amazing music and for a time looked set to take over the metal scene. A few years back, Steve Sinclair, who had been the bass player in Dyoxen, was tragically killed, making national news. And while most definitely not in his close circle of friends, it affected me deeply. I had my own memories of Steve, which led me to looking back towards those old Dyoxen songs and wondering whatever happened to the rest of the band. That's where I rediscovered Mike Sanders. Now living in Los Angeles, it was a quick lesson to see the evolution of this man as an artist, a human, and a guitar player. He had progressed beyond heavy metal to a more Latin rock sound with flavors of funk, soul, and beautiful Latin varieties with his outfit, One Tribe Nation. While not specifically metal, I think metal is still very much in Mike and still very much of his attitude towards making music that drives him. Mike very kindly took time out of his busy schedule to talk to me about those old days, the birth and death of Dyoxen, and his life since. If you've never heard of Dyoxen, YouTube that shit. Their album First Among Equals remains one of the best out-of-the-box Canadian metal releases of the late 80s, hands down. Here's our conversation.
Hey, how are you, man?
I'm excellent. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. Thanks for making some time for me.
Oh, absolutely, man. No problem. I feel like I remember you from kicking around London back in the day. Is that possible?
Yeah,
no?
it's probably possible. I looked a hell of a lot different. I often wore a pink tuxedo shirt with suspenders. That was pretty much my.
I feel like I would have remembered that.
Yeah, that was pretty much my uniform for quite a while. I wore pink and blue Chuck Taylors with black jeans, suspenders, and a pink tuxedo shirt.
Did you play in some bands?
I did play in some bands, but we didn't really do anything or go anywhere. It was just
right.
We were kind of like probably that sort of age group just behind you.
Right.
The only band that I ever even did any shows with in London was a band called The Hybrid, very briefly.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, so let's start with having you introduce yourself, if you don't mind.
Well, my name's Mike Sanders.
There we go. And that's our show, folks.
Are we? This is it? We're going right now?
Yeah, we're going, man. I hit record. I made a mistake. I had a really great interview lined up with Ron Reinhardt from Dark Angel. I've got a recorder that you hit it once. Like the setup I have my microphone going into my recorder, and I have my computer, which is where I call you from, that goes straight into my recorder. I have to hit it once so I can hear you. And I have to hit it twice so that I record anything. And I made the mistake of talking to him for about 10 minutes without hitting it that second time. So I don't do that anymore. I hit record as soon as I sit down.
Well, that's what Mark Maron does, man. I don't know if you listen to that podcast.
I sure do, yeah.
Yeah. Everybody's like, are we going?
He's like, yeah, we've been going for 10 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So unlike Mark Maron, I'm not looking to get into anybody's deep historical secrets or anything, but I do like to go back in time with everybody to sort of let's have the conversation about your trajectory. Of course, I know you from back in the 80s and your time with Dyoxen and all of that and the London metal scene. And of course, you did not, when I stopped knowing about you was not when you stopped being a musician and being a professional. So there's an awful
Right.
lot for us to cover, right?
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a rich history if you want.
Yeah. So,
I mean, it's basically after Dyoxen, I kind of skipped town and moved to Toronto, and then after that, it was like 7 years later, I moved to Los Angeles. But now what I play is way closer to Latin jazz than progressive thrash metal. So I'm not sure how that happened, but
but these things do happen.
they do.
So let's talk a little bit about Dyoxen. I was actually digging around in my stuff. I was listening to the album First Among Equals just yesterday. I was spinning the disc, and even now, all these years later, finding these gems on there that I'm like, oh, I don't think I've even heard that before. That's interesting.
That's
and
nice.
and I know I have the demo A Foot from the Edge somewhere. So I was rifling through a box trying to find that, to no avail. I don't know where that's gone to. But I just there were some pivotal moments for me when I was a kid in London, trying to be in bands myself, struggling with the idea that I didn't have a lot of talent, but I really wanted to do it. And then there were a few bands around, yourself, Dyoxen, and SFH. Were kind of, I don't know how it looked to you, but to me, music has always kind of gone into, are you an Elvis or a Jerry Lee Lewis guy? Are you a Led Zeppelin or a Black Sabbath guy? Are you and then for us, it was like, are you a Metallica, Megadeth guy or a Slayer guy? And the way it all kind of looked in my brain is that Dyoxen, so SFH was kind of in that Celtic Frost, Slayer vein, while you guys were more that Megadeth, Metallica kind of sound, right? So
there was a rivalry there, but I don't really understand why. Probably just young men suffering from acute testosterone poisoning. That's about it. I don't think there was any reason for it. I mean, I was talking to Bob Reed a few years ago, just telling him how impressed I was with how he's come along and all the things that he's done. And I've always been a fan of his songwriting. I mean, he's, even when there was like no computer recording or anything like that, that guy had a 4-track and he was always just like working on songs and working on music and putting stuff out. Very prolific, very focused, and, raising kids at the same time and working a day job. He's like kind of a inspirational blue collar musician in that way. And I think, with Bob Noxious, he really was able to sort of communicate that, and that's what people really relate to, I think.
Yeah, he's really latched onto that niche, and I think you said it right, like that blue collar sort of rock aspect that he does, and he's of course still playing with Razor, which
right.
has they're still doing gigs and touring and not quite as often as you'd think, but that's sort of what a lot of those old bands have fallen into, that pattern of like they'll do festivals and then they'll do nothing and go back to work.
I can't think of a better way to spend a midlife crisis.
Absolutely. Hey, remember that time? Let's do that again.
Yeah, exactly. And now all of a sudden more people show up than they did when you were like, quote unquote, relevant, because, there's a whole new group of people that are interested in your music now. And a lot of these bands are making more money now than they did back in the day. So it's kind of a really, it's a pleasant thing. And I said this to Bob. I said, Bob, you stick with something for 20 or 30 years, good things are bound to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I heard an interview recently with Mil Petroza from Creator, and that he was saying exactly that. He said Creator was huge in the 80s, but that's nothing compared to how we're doing now.
Yeah,
he can't even believe it, right? It's just one of those things. So let's talk a little bit about Dyoxen and about you. Like,
okay.
So how old were you when you started Dyoxen?
16, I think. I was 16. Or 16. Yeah, I was 16. So how this started was, I played in a cover band when I was like 15, and we just kind of, nobody really asked me for IDs, but we kind of tripped around just playing like Black Sabbath songs and contemporary metal of the day. And we were there we do those sort of 1 week or 2 week stands at one place where you play 345s a night. Kind of The band was called Chaos. I'm still friends with the guys in that band and come down and jam with them every now and then. But that really kind of got me used to kind of playing out and doing all that kind of stuff. And then when the singer Phil Thompson exposed me to Metallica. And when I heard that, it blew my mind because I was a Black Sabbath fan, but my brother was a punk rocker, and I listened to Discharge and GBH and all that stuff. So I got it immediately. I was like, okay, this is a combination of these two things. And then that's when I decided I want to do that. And I had met the drummer, Derek Kerr, through some other sort of projects. I think my first band, we kind of played together, and he's, comparable to Neil Peart in his playing. He was so good, and if you listen to that record, it's unbelievable how good he is on that record.
I was always impressed. I was always impressed to watch you guys play in that he didn't have a massive drum kit, but it always sounded like he did.
Yeah, he did not need one. To this day, and at this point, I've played with some guys that are, in the upper echelon of players, and Derek compares to every single one of them, and it's just a matter of taste when you're on that level. And he was always on that level, and it happened in the vacuum of London, Ontario, which makes it so amazing. He was unbelievable, because even the guy I play with now is a Berkeley professor, or he used to be. There's just an intangible thing that people have, or that people don't, and he had it. And so we were a really, really good team. He wrote the lyrics and I wrote the music. So we started off, it was me, him, and Steve Sinclair, who passed away a few years ago, quite unfortunately. And we just started writing songs, and I think we came up with our first demo, Apocalyptic Dreams. I started singing just because we couldn't find a singer. It wasn't something I really wanted to do, but if there's this sort of thing, and everybody's been through this, where it's like, sing it yourself, make it an instrumental, or be held hostage by somebody else who might have other interests, which is completely legitimate, but you have to factor that in. So we wanted some more control and flexibility in our situation, and then I decided to try to sing. After we recorded that demo, I can't remember exactly when we brought in Alistair Hay as a guitar player. And then I think Steve was kind of flubbing a lot of the bass parts, and we ended up replacing him with Andy Morton. That was the lineup that recorded the album. But before that, I think Alistair had sent our first or second demo, to his cousin in England, and it got written up in Kerrang. And we got like 4Ks in Kerrang, and there was like just this buzz happening in the metal press in Europe, which is really the place on earth that got us the most. Mm-hmm. Which was weird, because had we lived in the Bay Area, or had we been able to get over to Europe, I think we could have had a career. But, being in Ontario and being in London, whatever gigs there were spread miles apart, and there wasn't the kind of excitement and community that really was needed to support the type of music that we were doing. I mean, that was part of it. That's part of the reason why it's always hard to make it out of Canada, because of where you are geographically and where usually the epicenter of something is. Now, if it was today, it's a completely different thing, because it doesn't matter where you are anymore. With the internet, we're all connected. Yeah. But at that time, you had to be physically connected to things. So anyway, after that, we ended up, I gave a demo to Chai Pig from SNFU when they were playing at Key West in downtown London. And he gave it to his manager, whose name is Gubby, or Gabor Svoboda. He used to work for Cargo Records. And then I got a call from him one day, and he said he heard the demo. He was looking at some of the reviews we were getting, and he wanted to do a record. At that point, I think I was probably 18 years old. We'd been kind of, screwing around for a couple of years at that point, playing Call of the Office and trying to warm up for whatever metal band or punk band came through town, and going off and doing the odd gigs in Toronto and Hamilton, and trying to write more originals, 63 Monroe we played with a lot, and those guys were like brothers to us, man, like kind of like big brothers, because they just took us under their wing and just treated us great. Really wonderful guys to this day. Yeah. Then we recorded that record in Montreal at Studio Victor, this old studio that Sinatra used to record in. I really wasn't happy with the production of it at the time. The engineer we had really hated metal, but it was kind of a drag, because the producer we had used to be Megadeth's sound man, but he was not an assertive guy, and the engineer kind of walked all over him and us, and we were kids, we didn't know. He hated my vocals. And I sympathize with that. But at the same time, it was like, help somebody along, man. Help a dude along, man. You got to, when I have a young artist in my studio or when I'm recording somebody, I'm just there to try to make better what they have. So this guy was just really, really bad. So it ended up being a very, the band sort of imploded, not just because of him, but because of just the inner tensions in the band, my outsized ego, and the clash with other guys in the band, because there was really 3 alpha males in the band. Then my drummer was sort of a pacifist, but the really sort of fragile, creative, brilliant pacifist type. He would often get used by either side, to be honest, mostly the other side, as a sort of, he doesn't agree with you either type thing. So everybody, there was like 2 cliques, you know what I mean? As bands often do, separated into sort of 2 parts. That ended up sort of imploding, of course, because there was just such an extreme personality clash, and we ended up sort of asking Andy and Al. And then we've got Steve back in the band, and we got guitar player Brett Stacy to play with us, and that was the touring band for the album First Among Equals. And we all got along.
And that's the band
good.
listed.
We all lived together. What's that?
And that's the band listed on the album as well.
Yeah, which was a mistake, which was a point of, because we weren't trying to, a lot of the things that were sort of like the producer didn't get named on the album, and Alistair and Andy were not properly represented on the album, and everyone thought it was us, the band just being petty and vindictive, but really we had no control over it. But everybody was pissed off at us anyway. Later, everybody comes to find out that we had no control over it and all that kind of stuff. And as you get older, you realize that all these things that we fight over are just completely benign, stupid, ego-based complaints. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it all kind of, I think now we all kind of understand what happened and how hard it is to keep any group dynamic together. So when we started touring for that record, we started warming up for Sacrifice and doing a lot of dates with them. And those guys are, to this day, the greatest, most generous, down-to-earth people. We started working with them, and I think we played with DRI, and the DBC was another band we started touring with out in Quebec. And we were having a really good time. We were getting our music out there. I think we almost got signed to Combat Records. But what was really happening when this record was finally released, because it was recorded in '89 and not even released till like '91 or like late 1990. And then when we didn't know what the album was going to look like, we didn't know anything. But when we got it, I think I actually was at the record dealer, and Jeff Way, who now runs a intellectual property music company in Montreal, he's the guy who told me that it was out. He's like, "Hey man, your record's in the store. It's out, man."
Hey gang, you feeling sluggish, trying to find some energy for the gym, or wishing you could shed a few pounds and are struggling to find just the thing to help you? Then check out High on Life Superfoods. High on Life is the leading provider of hemp-based, nutrient-rich supplements intended to instill optimal health to those who wish to perform at the next level. Listen, I'm not just talking here. I use High on Life products myself. LIT is an amazing hemp-based, vegan, raw food blend that helps reset your body's nutrient balance and kickstarts your metabolism to get you going through the day. Use it as a shake, in a smoothie, or try my favorite. Mix it up with some cold coconut milk and cocoa, and voila, LIT ice cream. Do your body a favor, everyone. Go to highonlifesuperfoods.com and enter the code ForceFed10 on checkout to receive 10% off your order. But don't just listen to me. High on Life is used by some of your favorite bands: Suffocation, Trivium, Dark Angel, Testament, Body Count, and many more. These guys know what it means to need to keep up their metal pace. Try it and you will see the difference. I have. highonlifesuperfoods.com. Get it.
When that happened, if you remember that era in the 90s, this stuff was starting to go on the outs.
Yeah.
The big 5 metal bands, they were not doing fast records anymore. They were doing there was a Seasons in the Abyss, Anthrax had slowed down, Metallica had slowed way down, and there was really this is pre-grunge, but there was definitely some movement against the excesses of heavy metal. And, I think it was probably a proper response to just too many notes per square inch, I guess, and some of the the music that was coming out of Los Angeles and all that stuff, right?
I think history describes it as a rebellion against hair metal and glam metal, but there was an awful lot of collateral damage that happened with that, right?
I would say that's a very accurate the description of what happened. Now, in the middle of it, we didn't realize it. I mean, there was, you're young and you're still sort of saying like, hey, man, we're going to make this happen no matter what. But we just started to notice after a while, there were less shows that we even fit on, and there were less promoters and agents that had any interest in doing any of this stuff. There was really, it just started to not happen anymore. And it was getting to the point where like there was just like Pantera was the only metal band that seemed to be able to break through for some reason. And there was just, everything was just changing, and we had not changed with it. And I don't think we were even aware of the need to, or if we had any desire to, or anything like that. And then, as we all lived together, like 3 of us lived together in a house on Clarence Street in London. And that house is pretty fabled for the level of debauchery that went on there. And at that time, I think we were doing a lot more drugs and partying than we were making music. And we saw that sort of scenario out to its logical conclusion. And it ended poorly for all of us. It kind of took us years to come back from that and just be friends again and talk to each other, because it just got terrible. Because then, in the early 90s, there was a big, I don't know what's going on there now, but there was a big cocaine problem in London. And I think that's when everything the shit started to hit the proverbial fan for us.
It's really interesting to me, because you're talking about at the time when the album was released and going out on tour, and I do remember that time very well, because there was for about 5 minutes we were like thinking Dyoxen's just going to blow up, like you're going to be this huge deal. And in hindsight, you are a huge deal, because people are still talking about this record and still talking about how groundbreaking it was and how amazing it was, which is fantastic, and it speaks to your talent and the band. But having said that, I remember at that time I wasn't into coke or anything like that. That wasn't my drug of choice, but I sure did like the hallucinogens. And I remember spending an awful lot of time with Derek and wondering
Derek, then.
wondering why you're not on tour. I remember that moment. I want to quickly tell a Steve Sinclair story, if I may, as well.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
I posted something about this on social media when he passed, and his death was definitely one of those senseless tragedies. But I remember, so I was a few years younger than you guys, and I remember going to Toronto to see Wasp. I was going to see Wasp. I was big into Wasp at the time. And I was super stoked. They had a new album out, which turned out to not be that great, but that's okay. I found my seat, and I turned to my right, and there's Steve. And I had met Steve.
Yeah.
We'd met each other enough times that he turned to me and went, "Hey, man." Didn't know my name, but that's cool. And we started talking, and in about a 3-minute period, I went from being there for Wasp to not caring about Wasp, and I was like, who is this Slayer band opening up for them? And
Which tour was that?
That was
Slayer?
for that was Rain and Blood. That was early in the Rain and Blood cycle. They were playing with Raven and Wasp was the headliner.
Oh, yeah, and we went and saw them again after they came back on their own at the concert hall, I think.
Yeah, I was at that one as well. But I remember, remember because
I was at that one.
If it wasn't
Sacrifice and Slayer.
Yeah, if it wasn't for Steve and his excitement over Slayer, I might not have latched onto them, because
he had an infectious childlike enthusiasm for things that would just pull you in, man.
Yeah, and he had me excited about. I hadn't really heard Slayer. I'd only just been introduced to Metallica. I was behind everybody else. I'm not going to pretend I was there at the beginning. I absolutely was not, right? But by the time Slayer came on, I was just excited to hear who this band was that Steve just thought was the shit, right? And by the time they were done, I could have easily left the building and been satisfied. And as it turns out, that was the best of the night. I did stick around for Wasp, and I was all like,
that would have been a good call. I don't. See, that was around the time that those bands were starting to even the hair metal bands were starting to put out sort of their sophomoric mediocre records, and their business was starting to fail. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah,
I remember that. And they were starting to cross them over with like they were trying to be a little heavier or something. That was probably the play with Wasp playing, because Wasp and Slayer would not have played together in the 80s.
No.
Because it would have been like, no, we'll just get another sort of, we'll just get another hair band to play with us because that's where it's at,
Yeah. So that was I carry a soft spot in my heart for Steve for saying, no, you need to pay attention to these guys. And I was like, okay.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah.
We had a lot of moments like that. We were, how I met Steve was a moment like that. When I was I lived behind HB Beale, and I grew up super poor. I mean, I grew up, single mom. My father was a jazz musician who played with some of the greats like Cab Calloway and Count Basie, and he was part of that whole Harlem 50s thing, and he met my mom when he was playing in a band called the Ink Spots in Montreal, and they got married, and they had my brother, and then 5 years later me, but their relationship didn't work out, and she moved away from him and moved to London, where my grandmother lived. So I grew up like just with single parents, and then at that point I was living with my grandmother behind Beale, and just like kind of a ratty old apartment. But I would sit out there and play guitar in the backyard, and Sinclair was on the football team, and pretty much me and my brother and all that, we really didn't want anything to do with the sort of jock crowd from Beale. But he heard me playing like Ozzy Osbourne or something in the background, and all of a sudden this huge guy comes over to the fence and goes, "What's going on, man? Holy shit, dude!" And I'm like, "Hey, how are you?" And he's like, "Hey, I'm coming over." I'm like, "Okay." So he does. He comes over with his buddy and a bunch of beers, and he just wanted to talk guitar, and he just wanted me to teach him some stuff, and I did, and we just became great friends after that. I kind of taught him how to play bass, and I taught him how to play guitar, a little better than he was already playing, at least to the point where he could pick it up and play with the band. And I'm sure he went off and learned his own stuff after that. But that's how I met him. But it was just his like enthusiasm and his like, I don't care what's happening right now, I'm going to go over and meet this guy. And that's how our whole friendship started.
Awesome. So good memories there.
Yeah.
We've got to the point now that you've got an album out. You're doing some tours. You're playing shows where you can, but you've already mentioned this, and you're echoing. You're actually echoing things that I've heard from other Canadian bands, including Razor. Dave Carlo has been quite vocal about this. That it, had they been in the United States or Europe, then things probably would have been a little bit different.
Absolutely, especially with Razor.
Yeah, and it's at this point that everything starts to fall apart.
Yeah. Well, there was one event that I still don't know whether I made the right decision. But, Derek had gone out, and through the course of the evening one time, and we had a tour booked with Sacrifice. And through the course of the evening, he had punched a wall and broken his hand because of some thing that had happened at a bar or something like that. Just sort of like a bonehead drunken move that people do every now and then. And I'm not saying anything to be derogatory to Derek. I did plenty of stupid shit back then. So I empathize with him 100%. And the label asked me to get another drummer and do the tour. And I said, no. That was, sales weren't going well anyway. And I think that was the sort of nail in the proverbial coffin and I was really pissed off that the whole thing just sort of unraveled at the time, and I didn't really understand it. But then there was I had enough ego that I thought people, needed what we were doing and would wait around for it. But, now that I'm older and wiser, I understand that you have to, sort of jump on these opportunities when you get them to the extent that you can. And if you have to replace a member that you're loyal to, you've got to do whatever you can to keep the business rolling. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm gonna back you up on that. At that time, that time, it was all about bands being family and brothers, right? And
that's true. And we were that.
There was a lot of that. There was an awful lot of. I mean, I had that in bands I was in, and we were never anything. We were a cover band. I remember I've been in bands that did not write a single original song, and we still had that mentality. And it was very much like, you need to be loyal to this band and do this thing, and this is your life now. We're your brothers. And at that time, that's all it was. That was everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it lasted for years. Look at what happened to Jason Newsted and Metallica. That's
Right.
precisely why he ended up leaving the band, because there was this expectation that he had to have 100% loyalty. Nowadays,
Yeah, it was
though,
it was probably a little lopsided for him, maybe.
Yeah.
You know, but they may have resolved that with Roderick, though. But I don't know.
Well, it looks
I think
like
so.
it. It looks like
I
it.
think they have.
But nowadays, bands don't even blink. They don't even blink if they need to. If they need to temporarily replace a band member, they're all very clear about the fact that this is a temporary operation, right? Like, you know, Slayer's done it. You know, Anthrax has done it. Every band that tours has done it. You've got a drummer like Gene Hoglan that's sat in on pretty much every heavy metal band for at least a show.
Yeah.
Because of that, and there's now. Attitudes have changed. There's nothing wrong with that. So if this happened to you now, you would probably replace that person, not permanently, but in a second, just to keep the show going, right?
Well, now if it happens, because it's usually a different type of music, a lot of the players that I use in like One Tribe Nation or any of my solo stuff, they're used to being in that situation. And in Los Angeles, that sort of sentimentality is very rare, where you're like, no, man, that's my guy. You know, people are pretty quick to just kind of come along and you know, get somebody else to replace somebody else. But it's usually nothing personal. It's just business. You know, you can take it personally, but you should be honest with people. You know, you should say to people like, listen, this is what we have to do, and this is why we're doing it, and this is what I hope our relationship to be now and afterwards, and hopefully we can just still play together after that if it's something that really pisses somebody off. But in our situation, it was an all original band. Me and him had built the thing together. The label had some issues with both of us. Any chance that they didn't really support the record in any meaningful way, and our manager he worked for the label, so there was a conflict there. But that guy really busted his ass for us in every possible way that he could. But I don't know that he could have gotten the label to be more excited. I mean, they ended up being a punk label, and you know, he told me that we were just kind of a running joke around there. The whole thing, there was a lot of things that just were not working in our favor. And I think we needed more support. And, you know, I sort of racked my brains thinking, you know, if we've done A, B, C, or D, then we could have sort of kept the whole thing going. But I think because of the youth and my naivete and just inflexibility at the time, I don't think it was going to happen, you know, unless we started selling a whole bunch of money and people just started throwing opportunities at us that we couldn't turn down, and we could just stay busy enough to keep making other people money. Then that's how those things can stay afloat. But if you're not making anybody money, and maybe you have a drug problem and an attitude problem, that's not really attractive to anybody. You know, it doesn't matter how good your music is.
Yeah, and
so
that's been proven time and time again as you watch all these huge bands collapse in on themselves, right?
Well, it's you know, I mean, sure, like me, you've read a lot of biographies. It's all the same shit, but it's not any different in any group dynamic with human beings. It's just getting 4 people or whatever, 5 people or 6 people to all walk in tandem and to sort of agree on something. It's always difficult. People have other interests and people have their own idea of how things should be done. And it's always hard to sort of manage all that stuff, you know?
Yeah. When did Dyoxen officially fold?
I think in 1992.
Okay.
And it folded because of, I think, it all folded because of drugs. It all folded because of, you know, we all got strung out, and that was basically it. And then we started fighting, and we weren't playing. And when we were, we didn't sound good. And we all got strung out, and that's what happened. We just quit. And I moved to Toronto and joined Mind Rape, one of Ray Wallace's bands, the manager of Sacrifice. In 92, it sort of all came apart.
I left London in 92 as well for similar reasons, but not quite the same. I was working at Call the Office at the time and just drank too much and ate too much, and I went from being this skinny kid to like this fat kid, and it just was like, what? And it was all alcohol, and I can see old pictures of myself at that time, and I just looked like this bloated drunk kid. And
right.
So I actually headed off to Ottawa at that time too. So it was kind of. You go to Toronto.
Yeah.
How long are you there? Because I know you
7 years.
you eventually moved to Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So what's your trajectory? You go to Toronto. Do you slow down your consumption at that point? Do you realize there's an issue and you kind of back off, or does it take a little while?
I knew there was an issue. I mean, it was with that particular drug. I mean, it's a highly emotionally charged environment around cocaine. Like, someone will shoot you over $800 worth of cocaine, but they won't shoot you over $800 worth of weed. And it's kind of like, guns started showing up and desperate people started showing up. And, at some point I was drinking like a 26er of vodka a day, doing like an 8-ball a night with my girlfriend. It was really fucking unhealthy, and I was pretty aware of it, and everything was collapsing around me. So, I mean, I was certainly able to see that, and I really cleaned up my act when I went to Toronto and tried to figure out who the fuck I was again. There was a real trail. Like, it took me sort of years to sort of get clean, like, and just, because I would relapse constantly for about 7 years for the whole time I was there, until about 1998 was the last time I did that stuff. And then I just had to sort of work through it, and I started working a job for the first time in my life, doing some pro audio stuff for this company that a friend of mine worked for. And what I really was really surprising, and maybe you found this in Ottawa too, is like, in a bigger city, you don't really have time to fuck around like that.
Yep.
Everybody's doing their thing.
That's
and
right.
You don't have time to fuck around. Like, nobody's going to wait for you to fucking be hungover or all that kind of shit.
Yep.
So it's kind of like, and I find LA to be the same way. Now, mind you, if you want to sink to the depths of depravity in this town, you certainly can. But most people are just trying to just get through the day and get through the traffic and kind of maintain their lives. And in that world, there's no room for this kind of drug abuse. And one of the things about London was the lack of opportunity and the lack of jobs created this sort of dark cloud that a lot of people fell into. And I don't know what it's like now, but that was certainly, obvious to everybody.
I always remember London feeling bleak.
Bleak, yes, gray and bleak.
There's some beautiful, wonderful people there, but there's something about it that just always made me feel just a little blah.
But I wonder if that's just in our heads. I don't know, but I feel the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're in Toronto for a few years. What sparks you? And if I'm missing something, please tell me. But what sparks you? So you're in Toronto. You're playing in bands. You're working through your stuff, trying to figure out who you are.
Yeah.
What sparks you to pick up and go to LA? And is LA your first stop, or did you go somewhere else first?
Well, my father was an American citizen, and he died when I was about 8. So I had no contact with the rest of my family. And this is pre-internet. It's around 1998. I started, after being in Toronto for a few years, playing in a bunch of bands, playing around town. There was really nothing for me there. And I went to the Harris Institute, which was where I learned audio engineering theory, production, and all that kind of stuff. And I just really felt like there was nothing I could do with it in Canada. I didn't really like the music that was coming out, although I thought it was fine, but it's just, I didn't really, the 90s was kind of like a lost decade for me, for music. I just didn't really dig what was happening. And I didn't really dig some of the Canadian music that was happening because I thought it was too folky. Now I understand that why American music sounds, living here for 20 years, why American music sounds the way it does, because it's an intense environment a lot of times, especially the way things are going right now. You sort of look around here and you realize that it's like having a sort of dysfunctional relationship with a really hot girl that you really, really like, and everything is really great on some levels, but at any moment she could just fucking end you, So that's kind of what America is like. So there's always this feeling like the whole thing could just fucking unravel at any time. And I think some of the music comes from that because there's a lot of people here, and at different times people are being persecuted and all that kind of stuff. Right now it's Latinos, but they'll get back to black people again. But right now it's Latinos. And, this is all happening a couple hours from my house, and it's real shit that's happening. That shit doesn't happen in Canada because Canadians are so much more egalitarian and so much more accepting of each other and so much more just down to earth when it comes to that stuff.
Yes.
Now, so I took it for granted when I was there because it didn't seem badass enough. But now I appreciate it a lot more. I appreciate the reasonable sort of worldview and that sort of the Canadian headspace now that I understand it a little more. But anyway, I digress. I ended up sort of going through the process of getting my U.S. citizenship and putting together in my mother's marriage certificate, my father's death certificate. I had to find all this stuff between London, Quebec, and New York City. And one day I found, I think, his death certificate. And on that death certificate was listed my aunt, Claire. I had called up the registrar of this town in Long Island where the house was that he died, asked him some information about my Aunt Claire, and I ended up I told her my whole story, and she gave me, and she wasn't supposed to, her phone number. So I called up my aunt, and then they said that they had been looking for us too. And that weekend they threw a big reunion for my brother and I, and we flew down to New York, and there was 50 people there to meet us. It was really amazing. It was a beautiful thing. And then they just they gave me all this information on my father, pictures of him with these, music legends, with Chubby Checker and Frankie Lyman and all his resume that he worked for the Platters and the Drifters and the Ink Spots and all of these amazing things that helped me on my journey to prove that I had a claim to citizenship. And I took it all back to Toronto after, gathering more documents, walking around Brooklyn looking for public schools that no longer exist and all this kind of stuff. So when I took everything I had back to Toronto, at the consulate there, they said that they needed one or two more documents, which was kind of the procedure. They would just say, I'd bring them two, and then they'd ask for two more. I'd bring them two, they'd ask for two more. And I was like, look, man, this is it. There's nothing else. Because they were asking me for the death certificate of his first wife or something. I'm like, okay, come on. This is it. And the thing that really did it was the guy at the consulate saw this picture of my dad standing beside the Big Bopper and Frankie Lyman. And he was like, he remembered this era. He got all sentimental, and he said, you know what, I think this is enough. And then I got my passport. So when I got my passport, I went to New York, and I spent some time there, and I thought, maybe I would live in New York City. I have a lot of family there. But what I realized is that there was a thing about Toronto I didn't like, and it's the whole Type A thing where you have to spend a portion of your day telling somebody to get the fuck out of your way. And I didn't want to, that sort of is going to bring out the worst in me, and I didn't want to do it because it looked like there was just too many lines and too much yelling happening in New York, and I just didn't want to do it. So I went to LA for a week. I drove around. I checked everything out. I actually ended up going over to Lemmy's house and drinking whiskey with him all night once and actually doing speed with him. So technically that was the last time I did drugs. And that was in like 1998.
How did you hook up with Lemmy?
I knew him from an old girlfriend of mine in Toronto. I had met him before when he was warming up for Black Sabbath, and he invited us on his bus, and he shared a bottle of Jim Beam with me. And I was like, wow, this is so awesome. But the next day, I don't know, man, I caught some kind of like fucking Siberian flu that had me like writhing in cold sweats for like 3 or 4 days. But yeah, so I after spending like a week in LA, I'm like, well, this is it for me, man. This is just, no snow, sunshine everywhere. I'm in. Yeah, I think I spent another few months trying to close everything up in Toronto, and then I headed here.
What year was that?
2000.
2000. Okay, so you've been there 20 years pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So when you got there, did you just get a job doing sound engineering, or did you have a couple things in mind? I'm going to get a job. I'm going to start a band. I'm going to do some stuff. Or had you taken a break from music at all?
I think I took a break from making money off music. I don't think it was intentional. But I never stopped writing, and I never stopped playing in bands, and I never, what I was working on in Toronto was the first version of One Tribe Nation. In 95, I had seen Santana Sacred Fire, and I was always a huge Al Di Meola fan. And then, me and my buddy George from Toronto, we just kept going to Santana shows over at Canada's Wonderland, and we saw Jeff Beck and Santana, and we saw, and he was still playing a lot of the old stuff, and it was just transformational for me because the drums are what hit me the most, and the fact that he's one of those guitar players, and there might be a handful of them where they play, you hear two notes and you know it's them. You know what I mean? I mean, you hear two notes of Carlos Santana or Jeff Beck or Keith Richards for that matter, and you know it's fucking them, right? And that just sort of washed away this whole sort of gunslinger ethos that I used to have. It just destroyed it right there. I just decided that I wanted to do something a little bit more meaningful. So I tried to put something together in Toronto, and it was part of a learning process. And I had a studio in the Beaches, and I had a bunch of guys that were showing up and playing with me and writing with me. So we did this little demo. I took that with me to California and started trying to put together a band. And I put together a few different lineups. And some of the guys I played with, they were way better than me in terms of just being seasoned musicians and understanding different art forms. Not just, I come from metal, and that metal, I didn't realize how rigid it was compared to improvisational jazz or just fusion or anything, jam band stuff, which is all kind of loose. But everybody's got to be good enough to come back in. You know what I mean? Everybody's got to know each other. Whereas in a metal band, it's like, there's guys I've played with that if they couldn't improvise probably ever, but they could stay within the parameters of the structure and play perfectly as long as nothing goes wrong. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. What I really wanted to do was try to put together something that went more Latin. And then, as the years passed, I started playing with the best guys. I started playing with, the best percussion players. And then I started playing with guys from Santana. I mean, we had the singer. We actually he's played in my band and I've played in his. We had one of his percussion players, and then the percussion players that I play with now are all dialed in. They're all like once removed. Like my one guy plays in Zach Brown band now, but his brother used to play in Santana as the drummer on that Sacred Fire video that inspired me in the first place.
Cool.
So Danny De Los Reyes, he's played with Earth, Wind, and Fire and all kinds of different people, but him and his brother and his father are these like really soulful Puerto Rican musicians and Puerto Rican and Cuban musicians that have been around forever, and everybody knows who they are. And when you play with guys that are that deep, you just end up learning so much more. And then I met this drummer Josh, who really, really taught me to be more of to play more fusion and to improve my voicings on guitar and to try to be a little more open to other musicians just taking the lead on stuff, which I wasn't so much in Dyoxen, because I wrote every fucking note, you know what I mean? And it all had to go a certain way. It all had to fit in. So it took me a little, and then when I did my first record here, Servants of a Lesser God, it sounded exponentially better because of the people that I let do their own thing. And then that's the way I go now. I'm sorry. What are we talking about again? What was the question?
Well, we were just talking about the transformation of you into the creation of One Tribe Nation and where that all came from and where you're at. You've given quite a lot in terms of how you got there, and that's actually a pretty incredible story. I really like how you said that Santana moment just sort of really changed your perspective, and that's just interesting. It actually gave me a thought, a question that if I could digress just for a moment, that just made me think of that. We talk, and I thought about this a little bit earlier. We talk a little bit about how the 90s kind of killed metal, or that's sort of the general belief, except for people like Pantera, who for whatever reason seem to actually rise to new heights. Everybody else,
which is weird because they were the biggest, thuggiest right-wing band ever, and that seemed to be the thing that everybody was rebelling against, was a sort of jockish, thuggish attitude. So yeah, it was very strange.
I had an opportunity to interview them back in '92, and and I asked the question because everybody was aware of their power metal beginnings and and they were more of a party band.
Right.
But at this point, they were trying to be the new Pantera, and they were not a party band. They were they meant business. And I made the mistake of asking the question of how did the transition of being a party band to this Pantera come about? And I just got the stink eye, and we were never a party band. Okay, thanks Thanks.
Well, you got off easy.
Yeah, I think I did. But the thing that I'm thinking about, because metal was pushed underground, and you talked about how it was so rigid, and and it definitely was. Now, tell me if
Yeah.
you disagree with this, and I don't know if you continue to listen to a lot of metal, or if you
I do.
you do. But I kind of look at it. There were new styles of music coming up. There was death metal was happening, but that was
Yeah.
very underground. Black metal was very underground. It's all come a little
Yeah.
bit more to the forefront now. But you also had
Yes.
that operatic metal that was sort of starting to come about, and I look at the 90s as, sure, it was bad for metal in that nobody was making any money, but I feel like it was good for metal in that people didn't feel like they had to constrain themselves anymore. They could just sort of actually try the thing they wanted to try.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that this moment is like that too, because of the lack of record deals. I mean, you have to kind of question what you're doing this for.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So because to underwrite these things is harder and harder and harder. But I agree with you there, and I think that the whole thing, it might have felt like a lost decade at the time. But the thing is that the overall result is people became nostalgic. 15 years later, it came back bigger than ever. I remember seeing Iron Maiden on the 2000 tour, Brave New World, and it was amazing. And I'd forgotten about those kind of shows where there was like robots and explosions and all kinds of crazy stuff happening. Remember Bruce Dickinson was talking about how confident he was that they were going to rise again and it was going to be just as big as it was. And I remember thinking, yeah, probably not. But he was right.
Yeah.
It absolutely, I think they might be bigger now than they've ever been. You know what I mean? And that's because even though there was that period in the 90s, all that time they spent going 2 years on the road at a time, they just built up a lot of goodwill all over the planet. And it eventually came back to them. And they're doing it again. They're still doing it to this day.
Was that the tour that they had Voivod and Entombed opening up for them?
Oh, I don't know about that one. Was that like in...
I think that was 2000. Maybe I'm getting two tours confused, but there was a tour I went to. I think it was Brave New World in Montreal, and
okay.
I was astounded that it was they had Entombed, who was fully into that death and roll sound at the time, and Voivod with the other fella in the band there,
Eric.
Eric,
with
yeah,
Eric.
yeah,
Eric. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that was the same tour, but I guess they had different. I can't remember who was warming up for him here. But oddly enough, I think it was Yngwie Malmsteen.
Oh wow,
This was Yngwie Malmsteen,
crazy.
and he was really good that night. It was really, really a great night. And actually, Andy, the bass player from Dyoxen, was down here visiting me, and we went to that together. I think, or no, we saw a concert together. I can't remember if it was that one, but anyway.
I was just thinking, like, getting back to One Tribe Nation. So you started this up in what, around 2004? Well, you started it really in Toronto, but when you get to Los Angeles and you start meeting these new folks, when do you actually create One Tribe Nation as it is and go from there? And is it? I'm actually looking at your website, and is it more? So this is your project, but it seems to be almost just like an eclectic cultural collective.
For that's a very good way to describe it. For that record, that was sort of the attempt at doing it as a more of a band project. We all wrote, and the website was in desperate need of an update. We all sort of wrote on that record, but again, the singer had his own career going on, and we really had to start. We were starting to get some national attention from a video that we had done for Occupy Wall Street. Like, we did a video on the steps of City Hall. I don't know if you've seen it, but I can send it to you.
I think I've seen that on YouTube, actually.
Yeah. We started getting some national entertainment or interest, but we started getting a lot of press nationally. But we had to turn down opportunities because there was other people in the band who had other opportunities. And there was two of us that were 100% and two of us that were kind of like, well, let's see what happens. So, and I don't begrudge anybody for any. I mean, I still love all these guys. That's just the way it goes sometimes. And that's maybe they have a different story. Maybe they perceived all the events differently. It sort of brought us back to that sort of situation again where we couldn't have a band unit and be mobile. But to answer your earlier question, it really took me 4 years to get to a point where I was in the studio recording the first album, which is, I think, my favorite of those two. And then I have a third one in the can right now. It's not really One Tribe Nation, but it sounds like it, sort of. But it's a little more involved. It's got horns and it's got a lot more going on.
So what's your your release date for that?
I don't know. I mean, something else just happened where we may go out with this. There's this, my bass player, his name is Toli Ramirez Guerrero. He's from Chile, and he used to play in a band called Los Tetas, which, translates to the tits. That band is the tits. Anyway, they were like a funk rock band, like a hip-hop type band from the late 90s, early 2000s. The rapper in that group actually came to L.A. about a week ago, and he came in and started jamming with me, my drummer Dave, who's, if you're looking at the picture on the website, he's the other dude with dreads, and Toli. And we had gotten together right after the band that you see in the picture there had dissolved, and we started writing. And we wrote probably like 10 or 12 songs that sounded like a mix of like Funkadelic, Rage Against the Machine, and Red Hot Chili Peppers. So this guy came and played with us a couple of weeks ago, and it fit right in. And he's got a bunch of people that want to do something with him in Latin America. So it's very possible that that's going to happen first. But my record, I've been plugging away at it for a while. I took some time off to be a dad because we had Ava in 2014. So I wanted to make sure that I was there, and I've just kind of stuck around town writing, recording, and running I have a little pro audio company here that does some of the PA systems for some of the clubs and theaters and venues around town.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I've enjoyed. So I'm not going to bullshit you. When I was first listening to the descriptor of One Tribe Nation, I was all like, I'm sure that's cool, but I don't know that that's my cup of tea.
Yeah, I know.
And then
it may not be.
And then I listened to it, and I'm like, oh, there's some catchy tunes here. And then I listened to it again, and I'm like, oh, I like that one. And then it's just one of those things. You say to yourself, I don't know if I'm going to like it, but I'm going to give it a try.
Yeah.
And then and then I'm say to my girlfriend, hey, listen to this, and she's like, oh, that's good.
Which record?
It was the Servants of a Lesser God that we've been listening to. So
yeah. And the other one, the one after that, is more rock.
Okay.
Now and then I went back to that Servants thing, but built it up bigger with more musicians and more. It could actually get in on some jazz festivals, I think, and that's what I'm going to do. When I come back from South America, if that happens.
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, to put that whole thing together here, I just started meeting people, and over the years I put together this great production team and a great group of musicians. So at any given time, I could always put together a really great band, and at the end of the day, it's always, we're all friends, and it still is that thing of a bunch of friends making music together. We work out of a studio called the Steakhouse in North Hollywood that has a 64-channel Neve console that was from Abbey Road. And a lot of people go there just because of that board, because it's such a warm sound, and the drums sound amazing after just going through it. That's we have this sort of little clique of musicians and producers and engineers that we all work with, and they're sort of interchangeable in a few different bands. But the funniest, or the most oddest thing that I think I've done in the last few years was I ended up playing on a Nickelback.
Oh, cool.
Because the guy who produced the We Are the One record actually produces Nickelback, and he had called me up one night when they were trying to do something trying to do like a funk song or something like that, and he's like, I know a funk guitar player, he could be down here in a half an hour. So I came down there and I played on that track, and then I guess Flo Rida came and played on that track, and then that was really the only thing I've done out in public in the last few years. Because I've just been focusing on writing, being present for my daughter, trying to pay the mortgage, man.
Yeah. Well, Mike, I don't want to take any more of your time. You've actually been really generous. I super appreciate this conversation. Why don't we?
No problem.
If you've got some social media details that you want to give give out for either One Tribe Nation or your solo work or even your business? We can do that. And
Well, just like One Tribe Nation on Facebook. Go to onetribenation.com or like us on Facebook. And whatever I'm doing, it will make an appearance there at some point.
awesome. Thank you, Mike. This has been an excellent conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Likewise, man. Thanks for the call, man.
You bet.
All right, cheers.